James Carter walked out of the hiring manager's office without being asked to leave. That was the part he'd think about later. That he'd made the choice himself, stood up, said thank you, and walked out before they could finish deciding for him. The corridor was all polished concrete and diffused lighting, the kind of building that had spent money on the impression it made rather than the people inside it. He kept his pace even all the way to the elevator. The doors closed behind him. Then someone on the other side of the floor said his name. Not a receptionist, not security. Maureen Stafford, the regional director of Northgate Properties, was standing in the hallway in a gray blazer with her hands loose at her sides, like a person who had simply decided to walk somewhere and had enough authority not to explain it to anyone. James hadn't expected to hear his name in that building again. He pressed the lobby button and held the door. James Carter was 41 years old and had been running on borrowed time for the better part of 3 years. Not borrowed in the abstract way people mean when they're talking about stress or career uncertainty. Borrowed in the specific practical sense. Borrowed against his daughter's education fund, against the RRSP he'd cracked open at 40 when the numbers stopped working, against the credit line his bank had approved when the severance ran out. He'd been a facilities operations supervisor at Dryden Regional Health Center for 11 years. The kind of job that didn't come with prestige but came with structure, and James Carter had understood for a long time that structure was its own form of security. He managed maintenance staff, coordinated vendor contracts, oversaw compliance inspections, and kept the physical plant of a working hospital running without anyone noticing it was running. That was the job. When it worked, nobody talked about it. When it didn't, they called him at 2 a.m. His wife, Sandra, had left 3 years ago. Not an argument, not a crisis. A slow withdrawal that had taken long enough to complete that, by the time she told him she was moving to Calgary, they'd both been grieving the marriage for so long that the paperwork felt like a formality. What she left behind was their daughter, Maisie, who was 9, and a rental apartment in Sault Ste. Marie that cost more each month than James had budgeted for when they'd chosen it together as a temporary measure following the hospital's position cuts. He hadn't moved out of it. The temporary had become the actual, the way temporary things tend to when a person doesn't have the bandwidth to address it. The hospital had restructured its facilities department 18 months ago, outsourced the management layer. James's position had been eliminated with a letter and 4 months of severance and a handshake from an administrator who couldn't quite meet his eyes. He was 41 with a skilled trades background and 11 years of institutional operations experience, and the job market in Northern Ontario had received that combination with something between indifference and mild confusion. He'd applied to 71 positions in 14 months. He kept a spreadsheet, not because it made him feel better, but because it gave the process a shape, and shape was what he had instead of certainty. Maisie had asthma, the kind that required a maintenance inhaler and a rescue inhaler and a pulmonologist in Sudbury. They drove 2 hours to see every 4 months. James had been managing her medication costs on a combination of provincial coverage and the remainders of his severance. The coverage had gaps. The remainders were gone. Most mornings he got Maisie to the school bus by 8 and sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee and his laptop and worked through job postings with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to work orders. He had learned not to feel things too early in the process. Feeling things early was how a person used up energy they needed later. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November when the Northgate posting appeared in his feed. The company managed commercial real estate across northern and central Ontario. Offices, medical buildings, light industrial sites. They were hiring a regional facilities coordinator based in Sudbury, overseeing compliance and vendor management for 12 properties across 4 districts. Full benefits. A base salary that would let him stop doing the monthly calculation he'd been doing for 14 months. The closing date was 4 days away. James read the posting twice. Then he closed the laptop and made dinner and got Maisie through her homework and her evening medication and her bedtime. And after she was asleep, he came back to the table and opened the laptop again and read the posting a 3rd time. He understood, without needing to talk himself through it, why a person in his position might not apply. The gap in his employment history was visible and long. The restructuring at Dryden was explainable, but explaining it required the right context, and applications didn't always give context enough room. He had no corporate real estate background. The candidates Northgate was likely considering had come up through property management firms, not hospital facilities departments. He also understood what the salary would mean. what the benefits would mean. The specific, concrete, unambiguous thing they would mean for Maisie's inhaler costs and the Sudbury appointments and the credit line that had been sitting at its limit for 3 months. He submitted the application at 11:47 that night and closed the laptop and didn't open it again until morning. The interview invitation came 9 days later. He almost read it as a rejection before the subject line finished loading. The preparation took the better part of a week. He researched Northgate's portfolio. He pulled their publicly available compliance filings and reviewed their vendor procurement model. He knew facilities operations the way he knew his own apartment layout. Not from studying it, but from having lived inside it long enough that it had become a kind of reflex. He could speak to almost any systems or process question they put to him. The gap in his resume was real. The truthful framing of it was also real. He practiced both until they came out without hesitation. He also dealt with the practical problem of what to wear. His interview clothes were the ones he'd bought for a promotion review at Dryden 3 years ago. The last time he'd needed to dress for something that mattered. They still fit. He put them on the morning of the interview and didn't let himself attach anything to that. He arrived at Northgate's Sudbury office building 12 minutes early. It was a mid-rise on Brady Street, glass and brick, the kind of structure that was trying to read as contemporary without committing to anything irreversible. He came through the main entrance and told the front desk he had a 10 o'clock interview. The woman at the desk, whose lanyard read Tricia Kwan, smiled with the specific courtesy of someone who does this 40 times a week and pulled up his name and directed him to the 4th floor. The waiting area outside HR was 4 chairs and a low table with a Northgate Properties annual report fanned out on it like decor. James sat down with his back straight and his hands on his knees. He looked at the annual report without picking it up. He already knew what it said. He was the 3rd candidate called. The first 2 came out of the room with the slightly loosened look of people who had done something difficult and were relieved to be on the other side of it. James watched them without judgment. He had nothing useful to learn from their expressions. The room held a long table and 3 chairs on one side, one on the other. 2 HR representatives sat to the left, a younger man named Phil Doan, according to his placard, who kept his hands folded, and a woman named Carrie Archibald who took notes throughout. At the center sat a man introduced as Grant Holloway, Director of Regional Operations, a trim man in his late 40s with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, and the settled manner of someone who had conducted enough interviews to have stopped finding them interesting. James introduced himself, sat down, said he was glad to be there, and meant it to exactly the degree it was appropriate to mean it. The early questions were standard. James answered them with the specificity he'd prepared, real details, not generalizations, the kind of answer that either lands or it doesn't. He talked about the Dryden compliances overhaul he'd led in his 3rd year, the vendor renegotiation that had saved the department 18% over 2 cycles, the staffing model he'd restructured after a turnover problem in maintenance. Then Holloway picked up the folder in front of him, and his manner changed in a way that was subtle enough to miss if you weren't watching for it. Your last position, he said, looking at the page rather than at James, was at a regional hospital. Facilities supervisor. He said it the way a person reads a street address that turns out to be further from the city center than they'd expected. That's a different environment from commercial real estate portfolio management. James said it was, and explained that institutional facilities oversight shared more operational DNA with commercial property management than the category difference implied. Compliance frameworks, vendor relationships, preventive maintenance scheduling, multi-site coordination. He said it without apology, which was the only register that would have worked. Holloway nodded slowly. There's also the question of the gap here. He tapped the page. 14 months between Dryden and now. James explained clearly. His position had been eliminated as part of a departmental restructuring. He had spent the intervening period in an active search while managing a single-parent household, and he had used the time to expand his knowledge of commercial real estate compliance standards specifically to build toward a role like this one. He said all of it evenly. He didn't ask for understanding. He made a case. What came next was framed as a question but wasn't one. Holloway leaned back slightly and folded his hands on the table. I want to be straightforward with you, James. The portfolio this role manages is substantial. We're talking about 12 properties, multiple active tenant relationships, and regulatory timelines that don't have much flexibility. The candidates we've been speaking with typically have 5 or more years of direct commercial property experience. He let that sit. I want to make sure you have a clear picture of the scope. The HR representative on the left, Phil Doan, kept his eyes on his notepad. James understood exactly what was happening. He had been in rooms where decisions had already been made, and he knew the specific quality of the air in them. Holloway's statement was not an assessment. It was a conclusion dressed as context. The folder had probably told them what they thought before James had sat down. The interview had been the courtesy extended to that conclusion. He could have continued. He had the substance to push further. The specific compliance certifications he'd completed in the 14 months of the search. The Northgate portfolio building he'd reviewed and noted 3 deferred maintenance concerns in from their public filings, the cost per square foot analysis he'd done, comparing institutional and commercial facilities management. He had more to say. He chose not to say it. Not from defeat. From something quieter, the recognition that performing for an audience that had already decided was a particular kind of diminishment he wasn't willing to accept. Not in a building he didn't owe anything to. Not in a suit from 3 years ago. Not after 14 months of doing everything the process asked him to do. He thanked Grant Holloway by name. He thanked Carrie Archibald and Phil Doan by name. He said he appreciated their time, that he had a clear understanding of the role, and that he wished them well in the search. Then he stood up, pushed his chair in neatly, and walked to the door. Behind him, one of the HR representatives made a small sound, an intake of breath, a syllable that didn't develop into a word, and then he was through the door and it closed behind him. He rode the elevator down to the lobby alone. By the 3rd floor, something in the quality of the morning had shifted. He couldn't name it cleanly. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was something closer to the particular calm that follows a decision you'd been circling for a long time and finally made. He had not been willing to diminish himself further for a panel that had already looked past him. That was worth knowing about himself. He crossed the lobby, nodded at Tricia Kwan behind the desk, pushed through the main doors, and walked out onto Brady Street into the cold Sudbury November. The air had the specific sharpness of a northern city in late autumn, the kind that was either invigorating or grim depending on what you were carrying. He had made it perhaps 50 feet down the sidewalk when the building doors opened behind him. Mr. Carter. He turned. Maureen Stafford was standing on the front step of her own building in a gray blazer with her hands at her sides. No coat, no assistant, no particular indication that stepping outside without preparation was anything other than a reasonable decision. She was in her early 60s, with the kind of direct, unhurried expression that comes from having said too many things carefully over too many years and finally arriving at the preference for saying things plain. James recognized her from the corporate biography page on Northgate's website. He'd read it during his research week. "A few minutes," she said. It wasn't quite a question. It assumed he was a reasonable person, which he appreciated. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at her steadily. He had genuinely nothing to lose from whatever came next, and that was a clarity he hadn't anticipated feeling today. "All right," he said. She didn't take him back inside immediately. She stood where she was and looked at him with the kind of focused attention that isn't social, the kind that's actually trying to see something. "I was in the Timmins building last month," she said. "The Ridgecroft site. We had a weekend inspection and I drove up myself. Our operations manager had a conflict." She paused. "When I got there, the building's side exit was propped open. Turned out one of the service contractors had jammed it with a folded work order and left. Our tenant on the ground floor, a medical lab, had been running with an unsecured point of entry for 3 hours. James waited. He knew the Ridgecroft site. He'd looked at every building in their northern portfolio. "I was in the parking lot trying to reach my facilities team," Maureen continued, "when a man came out of the lab, one of their couriers, who had noticed the door and went looking for someone to report it to. He couldn't reach the building manager. He went back inside, found the contractor's vehicle in the lot, looked up the plate on a delivery receipt he had in his bag, and left the contractor a handwritten note on their windshield explaining the exact nature of the security issue and asking them to resecure the exit before leaving. Then he went back inside and told the lab manager in person." She said all of this with the calm precision of someone reading back a log entry. "I asked around afterward. The courier's name was James Carter, from a medical transport company out of Sault Ste. Marie. He wasn't a Northgate employee. He had no obligation to that building beyond delivering a package." She looked at him directly. He handled it like someone who understood what a security lapse in a medical facility meant, and like someone who understood that hoping someone else would take care of it was not a workable plan. James remembered the Ridgecroft job. He'd been picking up a specimen transport for the lab on a side contract he'd taken during the search. $43 per run, 3 runs a week, enough to bridge the gap when the other contracts dried up. The door had been open and he'd noticed it and dealt with it because the alternative was to not deal with it, which hadn't seemed like a real option. The courier company dispatcher confirmed it was you, Maureen said. Same name on the application we received last week. James absorbed that. What happened in that interview room this morning, she said. I'm not here to revisit it on Grant Holloway's behalf. He ran it the way he runs most of them, and I have my own view of that. But that's a separate conversation. She said it without performance, the way someone states a fact they've already made peace with. What I'm here for is different. She told him she made judgments about people for a living, and that the kind of judgment she'd seen in a parking lot in Timmins on a Saturday morning wasn't something a panel interview was particularly designed to surface. She said she had an opening, not the role he'd applied for, but a regional compliance lead position that reported to her office directly, with a 90-day orientation period and a full benefits package from the first week. The portfolio would be smaller than the coordinator role. The mandate would be broader. It would require him to demonstrate in real time that his institutional background transferred to a commercial environment. It's not a comfortable offer, she said. It's a real one. The wind came off the street with the particular directness of late November in northern Ontario. James stood with it and thought about what was in front of him. He thought about what it would mean to go back through those doors and sit on the same floor where a panel had already made up its mind about him. He thought about Holloway's face when James had thanked him by name and pushed his chair in and walked out, and the odd quality of that moment, the slight shift in the room that James had felt in his back as he left. He thought about what it would cost to say yes to something uncomfortable. He thought about what it would cost to say no. He thought about Maisie's upcoming appointment in Sudbury, and the prescription refill that was due at the end of the month, and the 3-month-old payment arrangement with the clinic that he'd been managing one installment at a time. He thought about the spreadsheet with 71 entries in it, and the 14th month that had just become the 15th. He made the decision the way he'd made most of his decisions for the last 3 years, not by waiting for certainty, because certainty was no longer something the situation offered, but by asking himself which direction he could still justify at the end of a difficult day. The answer was the same answer it had been every time he'd come back to the kitchen table in the dark, opened the laptop, and kept going. 90 days, he said. I'll take it, Maureen gave one nod, the kind that meant the practical phase of the conversation could now begin. Come inside, she said, there's paperwork. James turned and walked back toward the main doors of the Northgate building on Brady Street. Not a side entrance, not a service door. The same front doors he'd walked out of 10 minutes ago. He pushed them open and stepped back in. Tricia Kwan looked up from the front desk, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly into something she probably didn't know she was showing. James kept walking. The paperwork took most of the afternoon. An HR coordinator named Bev Stallings walked him through the offer documents on the second floor. Compensation, benefits enrollment, reporting structure, start date. His title was Regional Compliance Lead, and his position reported directly to the Regional Director's office, which meant it existed in a category that the Northgate org chart hadn't fully resolved yet. He signed where he was indicated. He kept his expression neutral throughout, which required some effort he didn't acknowledge. He drove back to Solsting Marie in the early dark, 2.5 hours on the 17 with a travel mug of gas station coffee and the radio kept low. He didn't call anyone. There was no one to call, exactly. His mother in Elliott Lake maybe, but he wasn't ready to explain it yet. He wasn't ready to make it into a story until he'd sat with it for a night. He started the following Monday. Northgate's Northern Operations Office was a floor of open workstations on the 3rd floor of a Brady Street, building 2 blocks from the one where he'd had the interview. He arrived at 7:50, found his workstation in the northeast corner with a company laptop and a printed welcome document from HR, and sat down and began working through the compliance files that Maureen's assistant, a methodical man named Owen Greer, had couriered to him the previous Friday. The floor had 6 other staff, 3 property coordinators, 2 client relations specialists, and a senior operations analyst named Doug Thibault, who had been at Northgate for 9 years and wore his institutional knowledge with the particular ease of someone who had stopped needing to assert it. Doug said good morning on James's first day and made no further overture, which James interpreted as a professional courtesy rather than a social one, and respected it as such. The first 2 weeks were the quiet evaluation that James had expected. He was given secondary tasks, document review, compliance calendar updates, file organization for properties that the primary coordinators were already managing. It was the functional equivalent of being handed the filing cabinet, while everyone waited to see what you'd do with it. James did what he always did with a filing cabinet. He understood it completely. By the end of week 2, he had a working knowledge of all 12 properties in the northern portfolio, their outstanding compliance items, their vendor relationships, their scheduled inspection timelines, and 4 specific deferred maintenance issues that had not been flagged in the existing documentation. He added them to the tracking log without announcement and sent a summary to Owen Greer's inbox on a Thursday afternoon. Owen forwarded it to Maureen. James didn't know this until later. He could feel the ambient awareness of the floor without anyone making it explicit. He'd been the new person in a professional environment before. He knew the texture of that particular kind of attention, the watchful, slightly guarded quality of people who had seen arrivals come and go and were waiting to understand which kind this was. He absorbed it and did his work. It was the Halcourt situation that changed the quality of the room. Halcourt Medical Center was a mid-sized tenant in one of Northgate's Sudbury properties, a specialized rehabilitation clinic that occupied the entire second floor of a building on LaSalle Boulevard. They had been tenants for 6 years. Their lease was up for renewal in 4 months, and the negotiations had been ongoing in a form that, from the compliance files James had reviewed, appeared to be quietly deteriorating. The senior property coordinator assigned to the Halcourt account, a woman named Therese Bouchard, who was thorough and experienced and had been managing the file for 2 years, had taken a medical leave 3 weeks after James started. The leave had been unexpected. Therese had been mid-negotiation on 2 outstanding maintenance obligations that Halcourt was using as leverage against the renewal terms, and her departure had left the account in an uncertain position. The client relations lead who stepped in, a precise man named Aaron Galt, had managed 3 calls with Halcourt's operations director, a Dr. Louise Fabron, before Fabron stopped returning calls, and sent a letter to Northgate's legal department instead. The letter noted that 2 HVAC issues in the clinic's procedure rooms had been unresolved for 11 weeks, that a 3rd issue relating to air exchange standards had been raised in writing twice without acknowledgement, and that Halcourt was conducting a formal review of whether to renew its lease at the current property or exercise its option to terminate and relocate to a competing building, whose owner had, not incidentally, been in contact with their administration. Doug Thibault came off the call with Northgate's legal team with the expression of someone who had been handed a situation with no clean exit. Therese was on leave. Aaron Galt had run out of ground. The 2 senior coordinators who might have owned this file were both occupied with a portfolio compliance audit that was already 3 weeks behind. Fabron had made clear, through the letter, that she was not interested in further conversations with anyone who wasn't prepared to engage with the technical substance of the HVAC concerns directly and with full knowledge of the service history. Doug walked the floor once, stopped at his own workstation, and then turned and looked at James. Not as a first choice. James understood that, but as the person who had read the Halcourt file during his first week and noted the air exchange issue in his tracking log summary, unprompted 2 weeks before it had become the center of the dispute. "Carter," Doug said, "the Halcourt HVAC file, how much of that service history do you actually have?" James told him exactly which service records he'd reviewed, which contractor reports he'd cross-referenced against the lease's maintenance obligations schedule, and what he'd flagged as the likely source of the air exchange discrepancy when he'd gone through it. He gave the dates and the document names. Doug looked at him for a moment with an expression that had no convenient category. "Fabron wants a call at 2, Doug said. "You're taking it with me." James spent the next 90 minutes in the files. The HVAC situation at Halcourt was not the result of negligence. It was the result of a contractor transition that had happened 16 months ago, when Northgate had shifted from one mechanical services vendor to another, and the incoming vendor had not received complete documentation of the clinic's air exchange specifications, which were higher than standard commercial requirements because of the procedure rooms. The new vendor had been servicing the units to commercial standard. The gap was real, measurable, and fixable, and James could explain it in terms that addressed what Fabron was actually concerned about, Not the technical failure itself, but the sustained sense that no one at Northgate was paying attention to the specific nature of what her clinic needed to operate safely. He pulled the original lease annex, the contractor transition records, and the air exchange specifications in a single working document and had it organized before the call. He and Doug took it together at the workstation, Doug on the primary line, James on a secondary extension. Fabron came on measured and controlled, the particular register of someone who has decided to communicate through a legal letter and is now granting a final audience. Doug introduced the call. James introduced himself by name and role and asked Dr. Fabron if he could spend a few minutes walking through what the records showed about the source of the problem before they discussed next steps. She said he could. He walked her through it without minimizing and without defense. The contractor transition, the documentation gap, the specific quarter in which the air exchange issue had begun. He referenced the annex clauses by number. He used the clinical terminology from Halcourt's own maintenance requests. He acknowledged, in specific terms, that the 11-week delay in resolution had been unacceptable and named why it had happened, rather than offering a general apology that wouldn't have held any weight. Fabron's voice changed somewhere near the end of that explanation. Not warmly, but in the way a voice changes when a person realizes they're no longer talking to a wall. She asked 3 specific questions about the remediation timeline and the contractor accountability process. James answered all 3. At the end of the call, she said she would hold the legal review pending the written remediation commitment James had offered to have to her by end of week, and she asked, not demanded, asked, whether he would be the point of contact going forward on the maintenance obligations. James said he would handle it personally. After the call, Doug sat for a moment looking at his screen. Then he said, "Send me a draft of the remediation letter before you send it to her." It was the most direct professional acknowledgement James had received in 6 weeks at Northgate, and it carried more weight than a longer sentence would have. The floor changed in the way that floors change when something has been resolved that people didn't fully know they were anxious about. Not immediately, not with any ceremony, but the particular quality of the attention James had been receiving, the watchful, uncertain evaluation of an outsider, began gradually to become something different. Something more like simple professional awareness. Doug stopped by his workstation twice the following week for questions that weren't strictly necessary. The property coordinator in the next station over, a woman named Roberta Nolt, began including James in the file review conversations she'd previously been conducting around him. Aaron Galt nodded at him in the hallway in the way people nod when they've updated their category for you. James noticed all of it and made nothing of it. One situation handled well. That was one data point. The 90-day orientation period concluded on a Wednesday morning in February. Owen Greer sent him a calendar notice mess for a meeting with Maureen Stafford that afternoon. James arrived at the regional director's office on the 5th floor at the scheduled time, which was the first time he'd been to that floor as someone expected rather than as someone who'd followed a senior coordinator for a building tour. Maureen was at her desk. She gestured to the chair across from her with the economy of motion that seemed to be her default. She told him his orientation was complete, his position was being confirmed as permanent, and his compensation would be adjusted to the full grade rate for the role. She told him that Dr. Fabron at Halcourt had signed a 3-year lease renewal, the longest renewal the clinic had signed in its tenancy at Northgate, and had submitted written feedback naming James specifically in the context of the remediation process. James said he was glad the Halcourt situation had resolved well. Maureen looked at him across the desk. It resolved because you knew the file before anyone asked you to, and you addressed Fabron's actual concern rather than the surface version of it. She said it without elaboration. That's not something I can build into someone through orientation. Neither of them had much more to say than that. He drove home that evening on the 17 in late afternoon light, the February sky pale and enormous in the way that northern Ontario skies get in winter when the trees are bare. He got back to the apartment at 5:15. Maisie was at the kitchen table with her backpack still on, working through a worksheet with the focused expression she got when she was concentrating on something she hadn't figured out yet. He made dinner. He sat across from her at the same table where he'd filed the application in November, and they ate together, and she talked about something that had happened at recess. And he listened and asked questions and was not, for the first time in longer than he could account for, calculating anything. Not the credit line balance, not the end-of-month prescription cost, not the gap between what was coming in and what the situation required. He was just sitting there, with his daughter, at a kitchen table. In the early evening, the benefits card had arrived in the second week of January, a small piece of plastic in a standard envelope, the kind of thing that looks unremarkable until you understand what it means. He'd held it in the mailbox for longer than made practical sense. Then he'd put it in his wallet and gone inside and called the pulmonologist's office in Sudbury and rescheduled the appointment they'd postponed twice. The new medication plan the doctor had recommended had made a difference by the third week. The nights that had been interrupted by Maisie's coughing became quieter. The emergency inhaler moved to the back of the shelf. That was the change that mattered. Not the title, not the lease renewal, not the confirmation letter from HR, the shelf. James didn't think about what he'd been through in terms of a turn of luck or a powerful person's intervention. That framing never felt accurate. What had happened was that he'd driven to Timmins on a gray Saturday morning to pick up a specimen transfer for $43, walked into a building, noticed something that needed to be handled, and handled it. Because that was what the situation required. No audience. No calculation. Just a door that was open when it shouldn't have been, and the straightforward understanding that leaving it that way wasn't something he was able to do. Someone had seen it, not to reward him, to recognize something that had been there all along. The application on his laptop was still in his sent folder. He'd never deleted it. He looked at it sometimes, not the application itself, but the timestamp, 11:47 p.m., a Tuesday in November, the week the gap between the credit line limit and the month's requirements had finally closed completely. It hadn't been a hopeful gesture. He hadn't sent it thinking it would work. He'd sent it because Maisie had left her school planner open on the kitchen counter that afternoon, and on the notes page in the back she'd written, in the handwriting that was still working out its final form, something she'd heard somewhere and written down the way kids write down things that land on them before they have language for why. He hadn't asked her about it. He'd just read it, standing in the kitchen with his coat still on, and then he'd sat down and opened the laptop. The planner was still on the counter. He hadn't moved it. Some things you leave exactly where they were, not because you're preserving them, but because moving them would suggest you'd finished with them. And you haven't. You're still, in the way that counts, in the middle of the thing they started.